Welcome to Planet Word. My name is Britt Oates. I am the manager of public programs, and I and the entire Planet Word team are thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's special programming event. I'm actually really excited to be sitting down for a book chat with esteemed author and linguist Michael Erard for the launch of his latest book, Bye Bye, I Love You, the story of our first and last words. Tonight's conversation will touch on topics surrounding end of life and coping with loss. If at any time anyone should feel the need to take a moment to take care of yourself, please do so. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest. Michael Erard is a writer, a linguist, a parent, and an immigrant. His work has been mostly about language and languages and the people who use and study them. He holds an MA in linguistics and a PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin. Michael has published 2 trade books about language, Slips, Stumbles, and Verbal Blunders, and What They Mean, published in 2007, and Babble No More, The Search for the World's Most Extraordinary Language Learners, published in 2012, which also reinvigorated scientific interest in language aptitude, especially its genetic basis, and which the New York Times called part travelogue, part science lesson, part intellectual investigation, and entertaining, informative survey of some of the most fascinating polyglots of our time. For the last 5 years, maybe plus, Michael has been working on a book about the first words of babies and the last words of the dying as linguistic phenomena, personal curios, and objects of cultural interest. And tonight, we welcome Michael for a discussion and the launch of that book. Please join me in welcoming Michael Erard, author of Bye Bye, I Love You, the story of our first and last words. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
So, something I did not mention in your introduction is that you are also a member of our advisory board.
I am.
Thank you so much. And because you're actually not so local, this is actually the first time you're getting to see Planet Word in its full glory, right, in the flesh, right?
Yep. So I came in yesterday afternoon and had a chance to walk around the museum, which, has everyone seen the museum? Okay, you know that it's awesome, right? And I was directed to go see to start at the 3rd floor, like maybe everyone is, and I did, and got off the elevator. And the exhibit there is about first words. And I thought, oh, they did this for me. Where's the last words?
Right, the timing, right? Was that kind of like a full circle moment for you? I mean, knowing, okay, we're going to talk about this incredible book, and coming to see the museum first time. I mean, I imagine that might have been a kind of, full circle moment given how long you've been researching first and last words.
It was great to see the treatment of that too. I mean, it was almost like, oh, they've read the book. They've read the book already. How is that possible? Yeah.
Love it.
It was great.
Excellent. Well, super, super excited to finally have you here, and especially to talk about Bye Bye, I Love You. In fact, Sally Tisdale, author of Survivor of the Endless Gaze, said in Michael Erard's new book, he looks closely at what we know of a baby's first words, a person's last words, and perhaps what we can know of humanity's words. A fascinating look at culture, ritual, and the profound intimacy of relationship. Now, I have to say that I really resonated with that small review after having read the book, both anthropologically, as my background is sociocultural and cultural anthropology, but also from a personal place as a mom who often reflects on things like linguistic milestones, right, of the kids, but also as someone who has and is still battling with personal traumas surrounding death and loss. And I feel like that really encompassed so much of what the book talks about. And we'll circle back to some of these things a little bit later, but what I'd love for you to do is if you could give your personal synopsis What is Bye Bye I Love You all about?
So, Bye Bye I Love You is about the first words of babies and the last words of the dying. I wanted to know what actually happens in a way that it describes what happens without reference to religion or religious beliefs, and that also tries to explain how these things became and remain objects of cultural interest, because it's not necessarily a given that first words or last words are interesting or are noted or recorded by people. And oftentimes when I talk about the book, the thing that people find most surprising is that first words are not universally objects of interest. And in fact, in sort of Western Europe, that cultural history, paying attention to the cognitive development of children in and of itself was not very interesting at all. It would have been a very strange thing to be interested in. So what I wanted to do, I think, was to also break us out of some of our presentism about first words and last words and get people to appreciate that where we are in our beliefs are the result of some cultural decisions that have been made in the past, and that those cultural models that we have may not fully be serving us in all of the ways that we need to be served. First words, I think, is sort of a less pressing issue than language at the end of life.
So, in other words, there's a lot to unpack there. So, I want to take it back just a little bit before we start diving into some of the things like significance, right, and interpretation and things of that nature. I'd love if you could share what was it that inspired you to embark on this journey of first and last words, and if there's a way, I'd love if you could kind of connect that, or maybe talk a little bit about what you share in the prelude into the pucker brush,
right,
and how that connects to what inspired you to really set off on this journey.
Yeah. So the origins of the book, I think, are really kind of captured, and it starts when I am holding my oldest son when he's an infant, and he's just making those kinds of baby vocalizations and noises, and I can't help but think in that moment that but appreciate that I'm at the beginning of something. I'm seeing something happen. We're very, very far from words. He's a week old, so we have a ways to go. But there's something that's happening, right? And I'm going to be there to witness it. And then I think to myself, and maybe other parents or other caregivers have the same sort of feeling, or maybe it's just me. But I can't help but think that that's going to end, and that if it happens in the way that it's supposed to happen, I won't be there to see that. And so, what is that going to be like? How does that end? How does that? I want to sort of know him fully. I want to know the beginning and the end. And connect them together. So I actually kind of started thinking about, first words and last words, what a great theme, I should stick them together. But, and there was a lot of literature in linguistics about, first words that I knew that I could rely on. But I was only dealing with the last words stuff in a very stylized and kind of abstract and distant way. It wasn't until probably 4 years later where I had an experience that kind of opened the door towards dealing with the end of life stuff in a more real way. So you have to understand that I like foraging for wild foods, and I was living in Maine at the time, where you can get outside of the city very easily and go foraging for wild blackberries. And there was one August afternoon where I was out by myself and came across just lying in the grass human remains. So what was left of someone who had ended up there at some point about a year previously, and I was shocked at the moment and kind of stayed shocked for quite a long time. And part of trying to understand what my role was relative to this person was, of course, because I'm a writer, was to write stuff. So I found out everything that I could about this person, researched her, met her family, met people on the street, and kind of tried to understand, well, how did she end up, there? Thinking that what I was doing by bringing her back in this way was also healing myself. But it turned out that that wasn't actually enough, and I remained troubled. And it wasn't until I started reading in the anthropology of death and dying that I really understood what I had encountered there and why it was so traumatic and such a problem for me, kind of psychically. And that opened the door towards a comfort and a familiarity with that as a topic and that as a literature. So when I got a writer-in-residence position at a research institute in the Netherlands, I had a whole bunch of time, and I just kind of asked that question, like, well, these people know everything there is to know about language. Maybe somebody has done something about language at the end of life, right? No. Well, maybe it's buried in the literature somewhere, and we just have to put the librarians on it, and they'll find it. No. I had a meeting, like, hey, I'm going to present some stuff, and what I'm going to present are just some questions. Has anybody done this? No. So that's when I realized that there was some work to be done.
Yeah. You took the initiative to lead that charge, and thank you for doing that. I find that perplexing as well. Is why haven't linguists paid more attention to words at the end of life as well? So again, lots to unpack.
Yeah.
Right? So why was or is consideration to research surrounding first words important? Why is that necessary in researching last words?
Oh, I thought you were going to go in a different direction, which was to ask why linguists haven't studied. Yeah.
Right, and I want to circle back to that too.
Okay.
Yes, but I want to because last words definitely. Right, we've got this question now. This sort of, why isn't this happening? Why isn't this happening? But there's a walkthrough of first words that needs to be considered.
Yeah.
So if you could touch on that. Okay.
Yeah. So our first and last words are these interesting things because they surely must have happened and they surely will happen, but we don't have any access to them. We didn't experience them ourselves. They made us, and someone recognized them, and maybe will recognize them. And they're part of ourselves, and yet they're not. So they have this strange kind of liminal quality, both of them. And so the question was, why do you need to do first words in order to do last words? Because you need to have some other way of understanding a limit of language, right, at the limit of personhood. So it becomes this kind of interesting control or a point of comparison. So you can go, how do we do something with a limit of language at the beginning, and what do we do with it at the end? There are probably lots of other limits, that we could look at, and and probably there's an interesting book to be written about the first things that people say when they wake up from anesthesia, or the first things that people say using brain-computer interfaces, and so those are landmark milestones as well. but the first and last thing, just because of the existential gravity of those moments,
Right.
those are really key, I
Yeah.
think, to address first.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you say in the introduction of the book, even linguistic curiosity has its limits.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important important point to make, even just thinking about, from a researcher standpoint. As researchers, and even we talk a lot about this in anthropology, there has to be boundaries, there has to be limits, there is ethics and different things involved. And so understanding, right, where those limits, where those boundaries lie, I think is really, really important in doing this research and understanding that.
Yeah. There has been more and more research on in people who are dying, in the very last sort of stages of dying than there has been in the past. So one of the things that I encountered very early on was the notion, oh, well, you can't study this because no ethics board would ever agree to this. But there's a long section in the book about some research that was done in Canada on testing the ability of people who are not responsive anymore at the end of life and their ability to process sound. Because there's this idea that hearing is the last sense to go, or one of the last senses to go, which really was just kind of a folk model or a folk idea, but it turns out that to actually be true to some degree.
Got it. So do we think that is part of what is contributing to the fact that there has been such little research done, or what are some other factors maybe that we could say are responsible for why this research is only now starting to happen? Into last words.
So I think, certainly you have funding questions, you have ethics questions. In order to get access to those sorts of spaces, which are very intimate kinds of moments, you need to be able to show that what you are doing is going to result in an improvement in care for those individuals or for a certain population. It's very hard to do that for the people who are dying. You can offer it for people who will survive them. There are good arguments to be made, and there are good arguments to be made for how it might improve caregiver communication and activity. But for the person themselves, that is something that you have to assert more than you can show evidence for. So there are those things. And then I think there's also this kind of notion that the ideas that we have about language at the end of life are enough. That if we needed some more evidence, that surely someone would have come up with some sort of research or some sort of way of understanding that. But because, and it might be problematic, but we can muddle through in the same way that we've been doing. So I think that influences it as well.
Absolutely. So I wonder then, that sort of makes me want to lean into talking a little bit about expectations and interpretation. Can we go there for a second?
Sure.
So in thinking about expectations, you have a chapter that focuses on the 4 expectations of first words. I'm curious to know a little bit more, if you can share a little bit about that. What are these expectations, right? How does that connect to last words? Because we're starting out talking about this under the context of first words, right? And then there's some connection and maybe even some disconnection when thinking about expectations under the context of last words. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So one thing that I write about is how there are basically 4 styles of expectations for first words ever. So there are first words that are prescribed. So societies, communities have expectations that babies will say a specific thing, and until they say that specific thing, then they don't count as a human, or they don't count as a language speaker, or they don't count as a member of society in some way. And places that are, and cultures that are familiar to us, right, have that in the expectation that all babies say mama or dada, right? That is largely something that is extracted from the baby's babbling. Does the baby know what mama means? Does the baby know what dada means? They don't. They have to be taught that meaning and provided that meaning by the adults, right? So you ask people, what was your baby's first word? Mama. Like, is that a word? That was a string that corresponds to what an adult would say, but unless the child knew the meaning attached to it, it can't really be a word. So there's that thing. Then there are cultures where they're sort of waiting for some quality of the speaking to change, or of the language production to change. But there's no particular form that they expect. Then there is kind of this mode that largely middle-class parenting culture has taken up, which is a kind of obsessive observation, which starts with linguistics and child psychology. So an intense attention to what it is that children are doing at every single moment, not just with language, but with other kind of developmental milestones. So that's the third one. The fourth one is groups that don't pay attention to first words at all. Sometimes because they are paying attention to other sorts of milestones, physical milestones or social milestones, or because they don't really pay attention to milestones at all because they're too busy, and there's just this notion that the children will, get wherever they need to get, in their own time. And it's important to say that across all of those approaches, children still become fluent, proficient users of the languages of their communities, even if the parents, even if the adults aren't listening to their first words. Now, you were asking, how does that connect to last words, right? So similarly, there are groups, cultures where there is a prescribed form for the last word that's often provided by like a religious tradition. So the name of a god, a prayer, a sacred sound, or some other thing that people are required to say. Christianity has them, had them. Judaism, aspects of Judaism had them, has them. Buddhism, I only know about medieval Japanese Buddhism. Hinduism has sort of a form of that, and Islam as well. So there's a specific form. Sometimes literally the last thing that someone says should be this sacred form. So in Islam, the person is supposed to say the Shahada, and if there's something else that comes along and you say, oh, I'd like some water, you have to go back and do the Shahada. Fortunately, it's short, but you have to go back and do the Shahada all over again. Otherwise, it won't work. So there's that. And then there is, I think, the tradition that we're more familiar with here, which is that there will be some idiosyncratic, individual thing that someone will say that we can sort of use to remember them by, remember their unique life by, and so forth. That individualistic mode, right, emerged only fairly recently in terms of how long people have been dying, really only in the early 17th century, when the Christian tradition of having a ritual last word starts to go away, and people start to pay attention to, maybe the individual thing is more important. The difference in all of those things is that the physiological conditions of dying oftentimes sort of limit or impede people's abilities to sort of perform the cultural ideal. So I've been really interested in understanding how it is then that people's experience and cultures deal with and adapt to that fact. So there probably isn't any other ritual form where there's behavior that's expected of people whose ability to perform the ritual may not actually, their ability to function is declining.
Right. And that also, which I want to kind of circle back to that, because there's an extended point and a topic that I want to get into about that in just a few. But it also sort of reminds me of when you start to talk about interpretation, right? There's one thing to have like an expectation, right? And especially if it's part of our sort of cultural norms to carry out a particular ritual at the end of life. And thinking about, circumstances. And this also touches on the topic or the idea of personhood in place, right? Who we are, how we identify within the context or the space of culture and environment. And so thinking about, in the case of last words, thinking about circumstance, right? Thinking about, well, I know that as part of my life and how I've lived, I, at the end of my life, am supposed to do this particular thing, right? But circumstances preventing that thing from happening means that I now have to rely on others to interpret, right, for me what I need or what I want or what my last sort of wish, if you will, might be. Yep. And so I'd love for you to tap into that a little bit about interpretation and challenges with interpretation at the end of life as well, because I think that's something that kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with expectation, and then you've got interpretation. Yep.
So if I understand the question correctly.
Because we've circled around this quite a bit in a few conversations, you guys.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me when I started asking people about their experiences, with last words, was quite often they would say that there weren't any words. Mm-hmm. And so if you go to the literature on, famous last words, and there's some popular books out there about this, it makes it sound like a very talkative time. Very chatty. Yeah. Everybody's got a lot of stuff to say, but you never get a sense in any of those works about, like, well, how is that normal? Mm-hmm. Like, is that what's happening, and where is that stuff happening? Like, when is that happening? And so what you discover is that people actually also have stories about encounters with communication that is not words. Mm-hmm. So, hand squeezes or eye gaze or facial expressions and stuff like that. And you start to get into a space where, and linguists now are starting to really focus into what's called the multimodality of language. How, I'm moving my hands here, I'm gesturing along with my talking. That's multimodal, right? And one of the implications of that is that the last words of someone doesn't actually mean the end of their language abilities, that sort of persists in some way. And certainly the language abilities of someone who might be interacting with that person, those aren't going away either. So you start to get into some territory where people start to want a signal or a meaning in a physical movement or gesture that might be hard to resolve in some way. So how do people resolve that? Mm-hmm. and sometimes, what happens is, and I think this is the beautiful part, there is no resolution, and there can be no resolution. And then what ends up happening is that people kind of talk about the experience and end up kind of telling a story about the inability to resolve something, rather than trying to come to some sort of definitive thing.
Yeah.
And I talk about this quite a lot in the book, that both first words and last words, and this is another way that they relate. I mean, they relate in lots of ways, but that we have this object, this thing that we identify and that we want to talk about, but we end up pulling it out of the circumstances in which it happens, and kind of cleaning off all of the fuzziness and all of the dangly sort of social bits. But these things actually happen in interactions, right? And there's actually all of this other stuff. And so I wanted to try to restore people's attention to the full nature of the interaction. It's not that the baby is kind of monologuing its first word with no context, right? Although sometimes that does happen. A baby will say something and you like, wait, what did that happen? As I was hearing an anecdote the other day. And similarly, some of the literature about last words makes it sound like these are just kind of broadcast monologue moments, but that's not actually what happens.
It's interesting. We touched on this yesterday in a brief conversation too about there's a kind of romanticizing, right, that we tend to get used to, I think, in our society in particular. I mean, I'm thinking all the way back to Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, thus with a kiss I die, right? Like it's that romanticizing that last moment, those final words, or glorifying that moment in a way that we sort of have come to expect it. And so when we get almost a reality check that circumstances, right, are not always conducive to being able to have that moment. Yeah. And now, starting to kind of like think about, okay, am I questioning the significance of that then? What does that mean for me in my circumstance or situation? And we talked about this. And if I can, I'd like to share a story. We talked about this, and I'm really, really appreciative that this is something that you talk about in the book. Are those moments of when you don't get the last words and why. And sudden death is one of those moments. And so I think that this was really important and resonating for me because of what I shared with you, which is about my own experience, my father. So in 2007, in July of 2007, I just had my daughter. I already had a 3-year-old son who's running around and being a 3-year-old boy. And my daughter just, the idea of sleep was the furthest from her 4-month-old mind. When one night, finally, I got her to sleep, and I got a phone call when I was about to, not, that moment when you're just about to fall in the deepest part of your sleep, right? And I heard my phone ring, my Sprint flip phone that I had at the time, and I looked and I saw, oh, it's Dad. Oh, it's what time is it? It was 12:15 in the morning, my time, so 12:15 at night, my time. My dad at the time was in Alaska, and I was living in Los Angeles, and Alaska is an hour behind. So I look at my phone, and I'm like, oh, Dad is probably hanging out with Uncle Jack and running around. I'll call him in the morning. I'm exhausted. And so next day rolls around, and I'm sitting and having a conversation with my mom. Thank God for my mom. I was a single mother at the time as well, and Mom was very helpful. Shout out to Joy Oates. So at the time, we're sitting there kind of talking, and I remember saying, oh yeah, I got to call Dad back. My mom got a phone call, literally in the span of 2 minutes after I said that. And I looked at her, and I could tell, he's gone. I knew it. I just knew it. She hangs up the phone, and I said, he's dead, isn't he? And she looks at me and she says, yeah. And then she says 11:30 p.m. Time of death was 11:30 p.m. And he had called me 15 minutes prior, and I didn't pick up the phone. Now, he left a voicemail. And a while later, my one of the kids, I can't even remember which one it was, dropped my flip phone in a glass of lemonade. And so the voicemail that my father left me was gone. But I kept the words in my mind, which I'm not going to share right now. But it was sort of like that moment of, I didn't get that. I didn't, I just have this message. Yeah. And that's all I could hold on to. But there was something about that just wasn't good enough. There's something about that wasn't good enough. And I think after that shock was really something that set a stage or set a tone for me in thinking about and talking about and dealing with death. My father was killed by a drunk driver. It was sudden. It was, completely unexpected. And extremely tragic. And my father was my best friend. So after that, right, after sort of getting hit with that shock, with the rest of life and all the things happening, within a year and 5 months after that, I also lost my grandfather and my aunt, who was a second mother to me. And these individuals, all family and loved ones and whatnot, what was really interesting, or lack of a better word, weird, was that each death was sudden and tragic. And so it left a trauma. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to think about this. I'm also one of those people who kind of feels like the energy you put out into the universe is what you get back, right? Karma and all of those things. So in thinking about it and talking about that after such a massive shock to the system, mind you, I'm 22 when my father passed away. And a young mom and trying to figure out all of these things, and now I have to deal with this and figure out how to deal with this. And so I say, there's a point to this, y'all, I promise. And so I say all of that to say that you asked me after I read the book, you said, did this help you? And I told you, yes, it did. And I think I gave you a decent response, but it was kind of a vague response too. Because I wanted to wait for this moment to tell you, yes, Bye Bye I Love You helped with my own personal issue and talking about and dealing with after all of the tragedy, because the truth of your research, and so beautifully articulated in this book, allowed me to discover a sense of agency in how I embrace the loss and signify the last words of loved ones. So in thinking about my dad, even though I remember what he said in his voicemail to me, right? And one could say those were technically his last words. I realized that those words don't quite cut it. And my dad, there was something else that he always used to say. He used to say to me, Britty, he had so many nicknames for me. Britty was one of them. He would say, don't sweat the small shit, because tomorrow is never promised. My entire life growing up until that point, that is what he said. And after reading Bye Bye I Love You, I decided those are his last words. Yep. That's what I'm going to hold on to, and thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thanks for sharing that, and thanks for sharing that final point. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
and we talked
really
about
special.
that, if that's something, and thinking about, having these kinds of conversations where there's academic research, right, and especially written and conducted in such a way that is digestible, that is resonating, right, regardless of where you are in your sort of academic, status and standing and whatnot. But I think that, being able to look at this research in a way that can help or can be used as a tool to speak even openly about personal trauma or about personal difficulties and challenges surrounding death and loss, looking at it through this linguistic lens, I think is super duper helpful for it certainly was for me, but in thinking about, last words and whether or not, we find significance in those things. So it was very helpful in that sense. Buy the book. Right. Buy it.
Listen to Brett. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Definitely thank you. One thing I want to kind of circle back to a little bit, and talking about things like marking of identity. We talked about this a little earlier too before we got started with this, right? What sort of serves as a mark of identity or humanness or otherwise. And an example that I really enjoyed reading about in the book was in observing first words, looking at linguistic norms of, let's say, a multilingual family in the United States, and then the norms of the Bang people of the Ivory Coast. And I thought that that sort of observation of both of those was really interesting in thinking about significance, thinking about meaning. What does it mean for first words? And I feel like that's something that we do with last words as well. Can you talk a little bit about that, or maybe that example a little bit, and if there's a kind of comparison or a contrast or a point that connects the two, thinking about multilingual family, U.S., versus the Bang people in Ivory Coast, and that significance, right, of first words or last words.
Yeah, so I talk about sort of some of the dynamics that multilingual families face around first words. You know, these are environments where there's lots of languages that are being spoken, obviously, and when the baby says something, there's lots of adult forms around to map onto what the baby is doing. So, like, wait, did they say? So one anecdote, right, is a family from Georgia, from European Georgia. The baby says, "Mama." Wow, that's amazing, Mama. Well, Mama in Georgian refers to the father. Mama in Russian refers to the mother. And there was a Russian-speaking nanny there. So you immediately get into this sort of, argument over, well, how are we going to resolve this, right? Not only is there like a gender dynamic to this, but those languages, right, or speakers of those languages are, often involved in conflict with each other. So how are they going to resolve that? And in that particular case, I think the father, the Georgian version won. Yeah. And then the Bang example is interesting. So this is a group in is it Ivory Coast?
Yes.
Yep.
Ivory Coast. Yes.
Yep. Who believe that children should not say first words too soon, because there's a balance of souls in the universe, in the sort of cosmos, and that when the child says a Bang word, that it kind of moves the soul from the deceased part of the universe over into the living part of the universe. And if that happens too soon, it means that something is going to happen, like the deceased part of the ancestral part of the universe needs to correct itself. And so people get afraid that an early first word, right, means that a grandparent is about to die. Yeah. And what's interesting is, so, given that first words are often these things that adults extract out of the baby babbling, I was really tickled to think about a group of people who were listening to babies babbling and trying to not hear words. And I'm like, oh, please, not that. I don't want to lose a parent.
Love it. Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and take some audience questions. I hope you all have some questions. We will have a person from our team, there's Caitlin, who will pass around a microphone. So if you have a question, we'd love to hear. Right here, second row.
Hello. Hi. To your last statement about mama, I heard from a speech therapist that language development starts at the beginning of the mouth, and that's why you hear so many folks talking about mama. And so that gets to the first word, right? But to the last word, as a retired Marine, one of the things that Corman used to say, the last words from soldiers dying in the circumstances, Marine sailors, et cetera, was mama as well. So I just thought if you had any thoughts about that particular development at the beginning, it's physical, and then at the end, of course, we ascribe a particular meaning.
Yeah, so people, have mentioned that a couple times, and my take is that it's not the same word, like it's not the same phenomenon. That developmentally the mama happens because it's the most default state of the of the mouth and the jaw and the tongue in that situation, and that people are saying mama at the end because of. So just to back up, there's no such thing as a natural last word, right? We come to our deaths as fully socialized members of a culture that have expectations about how to, do things in general, and with all of the, themes that are important and sort of cultural, like mythologies and all of that stuff, and that saying mama at the end reflects that. So it reflects something that's social and cultural, not something that's natural. And what the baby is doing with mama at the beginning, that's entirely natural. Now, saying that that's the first word, that's where the cultural sort of overlay happens. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question.
I mean, also Marines probably die saying a lot of other stuff too, right? That we can't repeat here.
Right here. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Michael. So you talked a bit about the literature of like famous last words, much of which is probably apocryphal. My favorite one was Oscar Wilde's "Either these drapes go or I do." Yeah. But in doing all this, you are a person of words who thinks very intentionally about his words and writes very well and all. Did it occur to you to think about what you would want your last words to be, and whether it's worth being intentional about, thinking about that?
This is actually the conclusion of the book.
And it's good. Try not to give too much away on that one. We want them to buy it and read it, Michael.
Yeah. Actually, you said something before that made me think of this as well. That what I think of when I ponder that, is I have a friend who said, your last word should not be something that you've never said before, that you're saying for the first time. It should be the last time that you say the thing that you've been saying your whole life. Mm-hmm. Yep. And the other thing that I say is, what I say at the end, I won't likely have any control over. But what I do have control over is providing people with a way to interpret what it is that I say, right? So I am not a believer in God, and I'm not a believer in the supernatural. So if I start talking about angels, do not ascribe to me a sudden deathbed revelation, right? It's something else. So I can at least kind of manage things in that sort of way. So that's that way, yeah.
That's a really interesting point, and we talked about that too. As far as interpretation is concerned, we sort of like circled around with that and thinking about, at the end of life, who we're able to rely on to interpret what needs to be interpreted. And I think that that's a kind of like fear, right, that exists. So I like that. That's kind of where the focus is going, is on, at least from your perspective, like the interpretation aspect, like who's going to be there to relay the things or to make sure the things that are happening in the event that I cannot. I think that's a really important, point there.
Yeah, I mean, and so this is a place where I think our cultural models of language at the end of life don't serve us very well, right? Because to the degree that you start believing in the importance of what an individual says, idiosyncratically and uniquely, you put yourself in the position of having to interpret potentially stuff that doesn't make any sense, right? And so how do you, like, what is that job, and are people up to that sort of job? So there, it creates a and people don't, I think, understand or anticipate the prevalence of delirium, at the end.
Yeah. Anne's got a question.
Well, this is
There you go, Anne. There's a mic.
very close to the bone for me.
Yeah.
My mom passed away in October, and the only way that she was being kept alive was with a very powerful oxygen tank. And before my last visit, she had a seizure. So I arrived a couple hours later, and she couldn't talk. But she kept waving her arms. And so I had to interpret that she wanted that oxygen gone. She wanted me to let her die and take the oxygen tubes away. And, I think that's what she was indicating and what she wished. But I will always have a little question in the back of my mind because I had to interpret gestures
Sure.
and not words.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Anne.
Not a question, but a
Yeah,
comment.
no, and those sorts of stories, are those happen, a fair amount, and it does really present a pretty big challenge. Yeah.
That's really amazing because there's a couple of angles there. Sorry, I'm going to deviate for one sec, you guys, because I think this is really important. I think that's important because that's one sort of angle, one perspective of it. But you also talk about in the book bias, right? Bias and how interpretation, right, can be connected to bias. And so there's one kind of concern from a loved one, did I interpret this right? And the hope and wanting to make sure that you get it right, for your loved one. But then there's another flip side of that where if you don't really have many people who's there to look out for you, right, at the end of life, then you're left up to other folks, maybe nurses or medical staff, right, to interpret what's going on.
Right.
There's some issues that can come up there.
I mean, better that you interpret that than having learned after the fact that someone had interpreted that in a particular way. Yeah.
Absolutely. More questions? Right here, center. Or we'll go this gentleman, and then you'll be next. My glasses friend. Yes.
Thank you. This may be in the book as well, but when you think about first words, with a few exceptions, you're conjuring up babies. But last words aren't necessarily associated with very old people.
Right.
So I wonder if you had an opportunity to reflect, compare in your book, the last words of the elderly with the last words of those who don't reach old age.
Who are children?
Children, adolescents, young adults, relative to octogenarians and people that hit 100.
I mean, that's a fascinating question, right? And it would be great if there were like a collection or a corpus of, language at the end of life across, sort of the age of death. But that sort of collection doesn't exist, right? And one of the reasons that it doesn't exist is, so it exists for first words because there's an interest in society to understand the trajectory of development, how to intervene in that trajectory, and to produce citizens and economically productive, individuals. There is no societal interest in that at the end of life, which, as I say in the book, it doesn't mean that shouldn't happen, but it just kind of explains why it hasn't happened yet. And one of the questions that you could ask is exactly that one. Yeah.
Yes, right over here. Sorry, she'll bring back a mic for you. Thanks so much.
Yes, I guess from the first to the last one, if somebody's born congenitally deaf, what happens? And then at the other end, wondering if people had collected from places that have medically assisted and dying death, and whether in terms of those words, people have looked.
So one thing that I didn't put into the book was like a discussion of the future of last words. Did I just lose my?
Yeah, maybe so. I think so. We'll get you situated in 1 sec. Now I'll work on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks,
Oh, no, wait.
Emma.
No, it's on. It's
We
on.
got it? Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. Teamwork. I love it. Thank you so much.
Wait, what was I going to say? Oh, right. Yeah. So I was giving a talk in the Netherlands, where I live, where there is medically assisted dying. And in the talk, I was talking about, use of sedation is increasing at end of life, which sort of suggests that there are sort of fewer opportunities for last words. I use the metaphor of a window or an interaction window, and sedation kind of closes the interaction window. But there was a chaplain there who's Dutch, who works in hospice situations with people who have elected a medically assisted death, and he said, in fact, there are more last words, right? Because when the doctor is coming, and so you get to say goodbye to everyone. And he said, people often have said so much goodbye, have said so many final things that that they get kind of tired, doing it. It doesn't mean that they're not special anymore. Yeah, but so that's what happens in that regard. And then your first question was about.
What happens when children are born generally deaf?
Yeah, so I do write a lot about that in the book, and one of the things that I'm proud of in the book is that it's modality neutral. Mm-hmm. So it's not that people, it's not that everyone speaks and everyone hears. Everyone produces language and everyone receives language, and so if anyone talks in the book, they're actually talking. And I talk a lot about, I write a lot about what happens with deaf kids who are in signing environments. We were talking about mama before, and the first word that is extracted from babbling. So for speakers of American Sign Language, the first word of babies that's extracted from babbling is this, right? Which is the sign for milk. Not mama, right, but milk, because this is a common sort of manual babble.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't yet read the book, but one of the things I was wondering about are families who ascribe a word-like character to babbling. One of the aphorisms in my family was, oh, Felicia used to talk a lot, but no one knew what she was saying, right? So this, like where parents can't extrapolate out a word, but still identify things as speech. How does that work in this process, or is it relevant to this process?
Sounds like utterances, right?
Right.
I think you talk a little bit about utterances in the book a little bit.
Yeah.
So in what how does it relate to what part of the process or what process?
Well, in terms of ascribing something as language, even if it's not identifiable. I've had students who have proudly declared that they were speaking full sentences at 3 months old because their mother told them to, and that they were, and I'd have to, and then their mom would call and things like that. So it was just wondering if there's a way of differentiating between first words and linguistic systems with children, if that makes sense.
I mean, what I want to talk about is like family cultures in a way, and I wish there were a way to sort of talk about what are the characteristics of families that would leave that stuff alone, right, versus families that would try to make some sense of it in a way. I'd label that kind of thing like pragmatic generosity. So there's a kind of way in which we generously assume that someone's utterances are intentional, you know, and that in that intentionality there is some sort of meaning that we can connect to or that we can decode, and we extend that pragmatic generosity to, you know, to humans that we have judged to be sufficiently capable conversation partners, right? And so if there's a sort of sense that the baby is like a legitimate conversation partner, then you might, you know, sort of say that that is language or linguistic. Somebody who's a linguist might say, well, the baby is practicing intonation or rhythm even though they're not making words. So they would be pointing to, you know, other aspects of speech that are linguistic in nature but don't bear meaning in exactly the same way.
Thank you. I just had a question about the last words. I kind of feel like there's both, we've talked about communication at the end of life, our ability, the situational, and how that might be interpreted, and then the actual last words. And so I was just kind of curious, is the book more of a survey about the different cultural implications of last words? Because all of a sudden I was like, oh crap, I have to think about my last words, you know? And
Yes, you
there's
do. No, I'm kidding.
now we've seen a few memoirs by folks who are diagnosed with cancer and they're doctors, and so they end up writing these beautiful memoirs about death and dying. But I was just kind of curious, should we be placing so much significance on final words, or is this more of just a survey of what cultures do think of them?
Superb question. Thank you.
Great question. You should buy the book no matter what.
Yes,
But, so what it is a survey of all of the things that happen, right? So what I do in the book is look at a historical data set from the first clinical study of the dying process that was ever done 120 years ago. So if you just sort of say, I mean, like I said, you know, what did someone say? What are the last words? It makes it seem like a very talkative thing. You don't get a sense of, well, how many people were silent? How many people were, you know, like, what are the other sorts of behaviors? So I use that data set to kind of anchor. And in that data set, there's like 486 deaths that are observed and only 16 instances where people are saying something. But the largest number of description is, the second largest is that people are irrational, raging, delirious, or whatever. But then the largest description is that people are quiet, which I really love, you know. So while the first words, you know, part I think is more of a cultural survey, the second part is more, I think, of a survey of all of the things that can happen, and then trying to understand historically, why do we have that expectation that the dying person has linguistic powers in the first place? So it's actually meant to release you from the expectation, right, that you need to have something to say. Yeah, you're all released.
Thank you so much. So if there's one key message, right? Is that it? Is that it? You're released from the expectation, you're released from the obligation, or do you have one like sort of key point, clear message that you want people to be able to take away?
I mean, I think it's this, that you know, that in the way that we all have a kind of default sense of what babies are like and what baby language is like and how to interact with babies, that there should also be a default cultural sense of what language at the end of life is like, right? And that you don't have to have a baby, you don't have to have kids or be around kids to know what that is like. You should also not have to, you know, experience death or, you know, directly or whatever to have that sense. But but have a model that kind of prepares you for what you're going to find. So the book is an attempt to try to build that out for the end of life in the way that it's built out for the beginning of language.
Amazing. Michael Erard, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.